Maybe you've used your VA home loan benefit before, or maybe you haven't. But today, we're joined with Mike Schrader from Guaranteed Rate. He's an expert at VA loans here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm super excited to have him on the show. Him and I have done about 200 VA transactions together, and he knows this stuff really well. So we're going to talk all things about how many times you can use your VA loan, can you have more than one at a time, and all the things. So let's get started here with Mike Schrader from Guaranteed Rate. So let's go. Tell me a little bit more about the VA loans and what they are, kind of the basics.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I think a VA loan is a great option, in many cases the best option for a veteran that's looking to purchase a home. A VA loan sounds like it's scary because you hear, government backed, and sometimes there might be extra red tape or things associated with that. While there are those types of things and there are some additional requirements that need to be met, to say that there's too much red tape just isn't the case. I would put a VA loan up against pretty much any other type of home financing. They are easy to qualify for. The processing time is just about the same as any other loan type. There are some key benefits to using your VA home loan benefit. First one being you can finance 100% of the purchase price of the property, so no down payment. Second benefit along with that is VA loans don't require private mortgage insurance. So while you're financing 100% of the purchase price, if you're comparing your options to, say, a conventional loan, in addition to paying your principal and interest payment with a conventional loan, you'd have to pay what's called private mortgage insurance to insure the lender in case the loan goes into default. In the case of a VA loan, no private mortgage insurance is required, so it actually allows you to save money on payments, ultimately because the VA and the federal government are guaranteeing them.
Okay, cool. And then what's the difference between a VA loan and a conventional mortgage? So a lot of people hear conventional mortgage. First of all, they think of 20% down and things like that. We know that's not necessarily the case either. But what's the difference between just a VA loan and a conventional mortgage?
At the end of the day, the main difference is the VA loan is insured by the VA, and it's set up to help veterans and their families secure housing. And it gives them more flexibility and gives them the ability to have more flexible options. It gives them more flexibility when they go to buy. Again, the no down payment thing is a huge aspect of it.
I got a question for you, Mike. So how much is the difference for a seller with a VA loan versus conventional mortgage? How much money different does a seller get at closing?
So you're talking the seller. What does the seller have to do with the financing?
You tell me.
Also,
how much difference are they getting at closing? Is the seller paying anything different in closing costs or anything now with a VA loan than they are a conventional mortgage, or the closing costs for the seller?
That'd be a good question for you as a real estate agent, but at the end of the day,
the answer is it's no different. For a seller, they're going to get the same amount of money with a VA loan as a conventional mortgage. The seller's going to get the same amount of money.
Yeah.
Wasn't a trick question for Mike, but it was just one of those, there's no difference. So for a seller, if you're thinking of, I should get the conventional mortgage versus the VA mortgage. Well, one, you're going to net the same amount of money, and then you said the VA loan is actually easier to qualify for, minus the service requirement. We have to service for that. But in terms of credit and all those other things that go into it, the VA loan seems easier to qualify. So as a seller, I think it's advantageous to choose the VA loan, but I'm going to think about it. So
sure.
You kind of touched on it a little bit. Tell me the three main benefits of a VA.
I don't know if we can limit it to just three. The biggest thing is the 100% financing. It's not necessary to come up with a down payment when you're using your VA benefit to purchase. Second big benefit, of course, is the no private mortgage insurance. You put this VA home loan up against a conventional loan, you're ultimately going to pay less if the interest rate's the same because you're not paying private mortgage insurance.
Well, I'll just touch on the Tidewater part too, the appraisal process. We do talk a little bit about minimum requirements and stuff like that too, but on the appraisal side, if the value comes in less on a VA loan, there's that Tidewater that they can invoke. If the price comes in less than what the offer is, the appraiser is actually going to contact the lender and let them know that it's less. So Mike, can you kind of tell me, if you could sum it up into 3 to 5 of the top benefits of the VA loan, what do you think those would be?
Let's talk about two first off. The number one being 100% financing. You can purchase without having a down payment, and it's 100% of the purchase price. If it costs $500,000, you can finance $100,000. The second benefit is there's no private mortgage insurance. So when you compare a VA loan to, say, a conventional loan, with a conventional loan, if you don't put a minimum of 20% down, you're required to pay private mortgage insurance to insure the lender in case the loan goes into default. With a VA loan, VA's role in the process partially is to insure the loan. So as a result, there's no private mortgage insurance required. What it means for the typical veteran and their family is tens of dollars to hundreds of dollars a month in savings that they wouldn't otherwise have to pay for the private mortgage insurance, while also having the benefit of being able to finance 100% of the purchase price.
And then we also talk about now veterans can make down payments if they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no requirement to go no down payment. In fact, I've worked with a number of clients who have made down payments that exceed 50% of the purchase price, and they still use their VA benefit because there are other advantages to doing that, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course. So what is the eligibility requirements for VA loan? I know there's certain time frame requirements and all that kind of stuff too, but just in general, like, can you tell me some of the eligibility requirements and what's required for VA loan?
Yeah, absolutely. In order to be eligible for a VA loan, depending on the time in service and the actual time of service, eligibility requirements are different. So my suggestion in the case of finding out, hey, am I eligible, is talk to a qualified lender, someone who really knows the ins and outs of the VA home loan benefit, and just ask them, am I eligible? And they can ask the proper questions to determine eligibility. For instance, if you're currently serving or have recently served, 1990 to present, as long as you've had 90 days active duty time, for the most part, that's going to meet eligibility requirements. Service is honorable. Another thing that I want to touch on, service-connected disability ratings. In the case where someone has a service-connected disability rating of 10% or more, that allows them to be eligible. So, even though I've given a few examples, the best way, again, is to contact a lender, someone who's well-versed in VA eligibility, and say, hey, am I eligible? And they'll be prompted to ask you specific questions so that you can get a COE application, COE being Certificate of Eligibility. Get that application to VA so the VA can process it so that you have proof in hand.
Then, the veterans can pull the COE, if COE themselves, but the lender can pull the COE for the veteran.
Yeah, absolutely. So a veteran can go direct to VA and pull their own COE. I personally would recommend that they speak with a qualified lender, because a qualified lender that's well-versed in VA loans, that does them every day, might see something on that certificate of eligibility that could save you money. A perfect example is I've had veterans that have provided certificate of eligibility on their own, and they happen to have a service-connected disability. The disability wasn't logged in VA system at that point. So they could have been in a situation where they went elsewhere and paid a funding fee. By the way, if a veteran has a service-connected disability of 10% or more, the funding fee that VA charges to insure the loan is waived. So in this case, for this particular person, they probably saved $4,000 to $6,000, depending on what their down payment was going to be. We're going to cut part of this. They save money. You look at that and say, hey, something's not right here. You're actually entitled to the use of this benefit at no additional cost versus paying the funding fee.
Okay, so we talked about the benefits too, with the no down payment. You need the no down payment, no mortgage insurance. And so now if they have the 10% disability, they don't pay a funding fee. Really, the fees of the VA mortgage are going down drastically because they're not paying a PMI, they're not paying a funding fee. So the benefit just becomes that much greater too, 10% or more.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one perfect example of where it pays and makes sense to really talk to an expert and find out where you sit. Most any veteran knows that the VA home loan benefit is available. However, there's a lot to know, and if you take a deep dive and work with someone who really knows what they're doing and really knows what they're talking about, it can be even more advantageous.
Yeah, I just found a stat the other day by the Department of Veterans Affairs. 60% of veterans do not know the benefits that are available to them. 60% of veterans. That's crazy.
It's unfortunate. Yeah. I'm glad people like you here are getting the word out.
Yeah, that's part of the whole podcast too, is just trying to get it out, get lenders that know what they're doing, that aren't killing dreams, and make sure people know what's going on. So, and then lately, I kind of call it pimping out VA loans sometimes because of the assumable part. A lot of realtors have advertised, hey, get an assumable VA loan, blah, 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 right? A lot of us have seen the marketing for it, but can you kind of go over the assumable feature of the VA loan? Like, what does it even mean for a VA loan to be assumable?
So, VA loans are assumable, which means that, let's say you sell the property, someone can take over your VA-backed loan and basically pay the payments that you were paying instead of them going and getting their own loan to purchase a property. Where it's advantageous right now is interest rates are higher than they were, say, in 2020 or 2021, significantly higher. So if you're a veteran and you're listing or trying to sell your home, like you said, with agents trying to push this, you can essentially market your home in a way that's, hey, this is actually going to be less costly for you, because instead of paying the going interest rate today, which as we speak is around 7% on a 30-year fixed mortgage, you can lock in a rate that's 2.25%, 2.5%, 3%, because you're essentially taking over the loan that the veteran initially took out at that lower rate. Is it something that I recommend for everyone? Not necessarily. However, it's an option that's there. Just to break it down a little bit, while VA loans can be assumed, the loan servicer that holds the loan currently has to approve the assumption. So ultimately, the buyer of the property would have to qualify for that loan. There are some potential drawbacks to it. Number one is if the loan is assumed by a non-veteran, which you can do, by the way. There's a big misconception that only veterans can assume VA loans. That's just not the case.
You're going to take all my talking points away from me here.
Yeah, that's the right question. That's the right question. What can I say? So in the case where a loan is assumed by a non-veteran, the issue becomes with VA entitlement, because that entitlement is still tied to the veteran that took out the loan. The loan is tied to their entitlement. It's a better way to put it. If a veteran assumes the loan, the entitlement can be transferred.
So Mike, can a non-veteran assume a VA loan?
Yes, absolutely. That's a common misconception. A lot of people, even in our industry that are well-versed, tend to think that only a veteran can assume a VA loan. But the reality is a non-veteran can, yeah.
And then what are some of the disadvantages, Mike, of a veteran letting a non-veteran assume their VA loan?
So any VA loan that a veteran has is tied to what's called their available entitlement. If a non-veteran assumes the VA loan, the available entitlement or the entitlement for the VA loan is still tied to the veteran that originally took it out. So what that means is that it may cause for the original veteran taking out the loan to not be able to finance as much when they go to purchase their second property or the new property that they're going to move into as a primary residence. Long story short on that, if it's a non-veteran assuming the loan, I recommend that the veteran sits down and talks to someone who works with VA loans regularly to determine how much can I still borrow in the future, because ultimately that VA loan is still going to be tied to that.
And then how much is a veteran's entitlement? What's the amount? Is every veteran different for their entitlement, or is it the same for everybody?
Generally, it's the same for everyone, but that's a loaded question. It depends on the loan amount and the purchase price of the property. Without going into too much detail on that, the best way to determine available entitlement and if you're allowed to finance a specific amount using your VA benefit, go to a qualified VA lender and say, hey, what's my entitlement? Explain it to me. How does it play into what I'm trying to do?
And then the next is, how would a person find, you reference a lot of qualified VA lender. How would a person find a lender? We're in Madison, Wisconsin, right? But should we go to Google and just Google VA lenders near me, or who's the best VA lender? What is the best way for somebody to find a VA lender that knows what they're doing?
I mean, I think in our technology age, it's pretty easy to go online and find a great lender. I think a better way to find a good VA lender is to talk to the real estate agent that you're working with, especially one that's well-versed in working with military families, because that real estate agent will have gone through the VA loan process with many different clients, and they can determine, hey, is this particular lender? Are there many, many good lenders out there, to be real? However, not all are as well-versed as others. And it's important that you understand that there's, that hands-on experience that means something if there's a problem that's to arise. The other thing about that as well, another important thing that I recommend is when you're talking to different lenders, ask them the question, how often are you looking at the loans? What's your experience with this? What can you tell me? Because if you're talking to a lender that claims they do a lot of them, sometimes they might not. Just because they know it doesn't mean they're doing it.
Yeah, sometimes what I do is, lenders call me and say, hey, we do VA loans, and they try to get us to work with them, because that's a lot of lenders is trying to recruit realtors to come and work with them so they can get our business or our clients' businesses. I start calling them for questions.
Yep.
Like, hey, can you tell me what the Tidewater process? Can you tell me what the VA funding fee? Can the funding fee be waived? How do I get my entitlements? Or can my entitlement be restored if I file foreclosure? All these random kind of scenarios, and it's kind of a good question to answer. They might get irritated, but if you guys know me, I work with probably like 2 or 3 different lenders. Mike being one of the main ones, and so but not a lot of people fit the bill for a VA lender. Book of business, very few people that I trust, like in very small circles. Personally, just they call Mike.
I appreciate it.
But it's just, you want to make sure you're getting the right freaking service. So my VA closing costs. So veterans, as we talked about, they're service connected, they don't pay a funding fee. Or if they're not service connected, they're going to pay the funding fee. But what are some of the typical closing costs that veterans will obtain or have with the VA?
So closing costs for a VA loan aren't typically too much different than they would be for any other loan type. The big thing to point out that you touched on is VA loans do have a funding fee. The funding fee can vary based on the amount financed. It can also vary based on whether it's the first, second, or third time, even for that matter, that you're using your VA benefit. So definitely be aware of the funding fee that VA charges. And if you have a 10% service-connected disability or more, there is no funding fee on a VA loan, which can be quite helpful and save a lot of money. But generally, again, closing costs are very, very similar to what they would be with a conventional loan. Depending on where the property is located, there may be some additional fees. In many areas of the country, wood destroying insect or termite inspection is required, so there may be an additional cost for that. But generally, closing costs are pretty similar, with the exception of that VA funding fee, as they would be for any other loan.
So in the state of Wisconsin, or in some of the parts of Wisconsin, probably the lower southern half, the VA does require a termite inspection.
Yeah, most areas of the country, termite inspections are required. Here in Wisconsin, which is a place where we do a lot of business, it's the 20 southernmost counties in the state where termite inspections are required.
VA home inspection, but it doesn't really exist. So let's talk conceptions too. Is the VA is going to do an appraisal to figure out the value of the property and the condition of the property to make sure it meets certain minimum property requirements.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and touching on that, I mean, you as an experienced real estate agent that works with military families, there's not a separate VA inspection per se. The appraiser is trained with their watchful eye to determine if a property is going to meet VA minimum property requirements. And a lot of times people say, hey, this is going to be a lot. Like, there are all these extra steps we have to take for this. The reality is not really. I mean, VA is really looking for three things. Is the property safe? Is it sound?
Language, what the safe, sound, and sanitary means. Like, is it a crime neighborhood? Is it full of like desanitizer? What does safe, sound, and sanitary mean?
So no, not anything to do with what the neighborhood's like. You can use your VA loan in any neighborhood. Are there major safety problems? Perfect example of this would be, is there peeling lead paint, for instance, if the property was built prior to 1978? If there is, that could be a safety hazard, right? Sanitary, water source. Not all properties are connected to city water. If you have a private well, if you have septic, there are different things that are going to be looked at to determine whether or not those things are sanitary or safe, right? If it's a private well, there's going to be a water test. Does the water at least meet the requirements that the locality has for water? Those are a couple of the big ones. I'm sure you've run into many more. Do you have any you want to ask me about?
Well, yeah, first I want to talk about, so in the state of Wisconsin, we have our standard offer to purchase, right? But when you use a VA loan, if you use the addendum that realtors use for the water septic test and well test and stuff like that, what additional things does a veteran need to test for with the water if they have a well in the state of Wisconsin that's necessarily standard?
So that's a loaded question, because as it sits, the water test that's required for a VA loan is a water test that's meant to meet local requirements wherever the loan's taken out. Wisconsin's a tricky one because Wisconsin has real estate transfer requirements in terms of what needs to be tested for. But Wisconsin on private well and septic does not have any specific laws that speak to the quality of water itself. So in that case, and in many cases where the laws are similar, what will happen is the VA will require that the water is tested to meet EPA standards. So if you're in Wisconsin, it's common to test for nitrates and nitrites, E. coli, so coliform bacteria, and lead. And in many cases, a pH test is required as well. Not necessarily that's something that lender by lender may or may not. But generally speaking, if the water meets local requirements and anything that a local area would require for water safety is met, you'll be fine with yours.
Just so you guys know, I'm not completely stupid. I do know a lot of these answers, but I want you guys to know the answers too. So I asked them the question. So, a lot of people want to use their VA loan. They want to maybe use it for a second home, right? So can you use your VA loan for a second home in Madison? Madison?
So the VA home loan benefit is designed to be a homeownership program. It's meant to be a program that you use to purchase your primary residence to be used for you and your family to live in. So to purchase what we in the industry call a second home, like a lake house or on some land somewhere or something like that, there's not a way to really use your VA benefit to do that, because the intention is you're buying for a primary residence for you and your family. However, there are some exceptions to that, and they aren't really exceptions per se, but in the sense, they're exceptions in the sense that, let's say you convert your primary residence to a second home or an investment property at a later point in time. You're absolutely allowed to do that. The VA is flexible on that in a certain way. Perfect example of that would be, let's say PCS orders drop, you have to move yourself across the country. VA is not going to have a problem with you keeping your VA loan tied to the property that you move out of if you decide to rent it to somebody else when you have to be on orders in a different place permanently. Generally, primary residence, that's a requirement, but if situations arise where you've purchased a home using your VA benefit and it can no longer be your primary residence, contact your lender. We can talk about what your options are if you need to talk about those options, but in most cases, there's no.
And they have a house with a VA loan, right? And they want to rent that house out or just another home. They can do that.
They can definitely do that. The key is the home that they're purchasing, they have to intend. But yeah, that's definitely an option. I would still say consult your lender on that. Just make sure that what you're doing makes sense and it's within the rules and the guidelines.
Okay. And then can you purchase like an investment property, like a 4-unit building with a VA loan? Too many times, but can you use a VA loan on a manufactured home?
Yeah, absolutely. The key is going to be that the manufactured home has to be titled as real property. So, if you have your single wide trailer and you just parked it there and it's up on blocks, yeah, it's probably not going to work. But if you've attached it to a permanent foundation, it's permanently affixed to the land, and in your local area, it's considered part of the real estate, you can absolutely use your VA benefit to purchase manufactured housing. This is a topic that is pretty complex. So again, you're going to want to talk to a VA lender that's well-versed in working. If you intend to occupy it, yeah, absolutely. If your intention is to just use it solely as an investment property, VA benefit is not something you're going to want to use for that, because the key is occupancy. Again, the VA home loan benefit, it's a housing program. It's designed to put families and veterans into their permanent.
And then manufactured homes, we've done this a couple times, not too many times, but can you use a VA loan on a manufactured home?
Yeah, absolutely. The key is going to be that the manufactured home has to be titled as real property. So, if you have your single wide trailer and you just parked it there and it's up on blocks, yeah, it's probably not going to work. But if you've attached it to a permanent foundation, it's permanently affixed to the land, and in your local area, it's considered real estate, you can absolutely use your VA benefit to purchase manufactured housing. This is a topic that is pretty complex. So again, you're going to want to talk to a VA lender that's well versed in working with manufactured homes, just to make sure that, number one, the home you're going to purchase or finance with your VA loan benefit is eligible, and number two, for something else, to ensure that at the end of the day, there's a lot more flexibility in underwriting for a VA loan than many other loan types, so they're more easily approvable. So that's a plus. The other plus with VA loans is that industry-wide, in terms of loan statistics, VA loans have one of the lowest default rates out there, which basically means that borrowers are less likely to go into default, more likely to make their payments, which in turn means, or altogether means, that they're very, very qualified. I can see sometimes working in this real estate market where sellers are discouraged when they see a veteran buyer come in and say, I want to use my VA home loan benefit. Quite frankly, they shouldn't be, because it really is an easy approval, just as a conventional loan would be. But ultimately, a veteran earned their VA benefit, and there's a reason that they're using it. There are key advantages.
Yeah, and one thing, Mike, that we talk about sometimes, you and I, is, sometimes one of the main problems sometimes is just the realtors in general not knowing, they're not educated. Yeah. But we have some clients, they use their VA loan and they want to put 0% down because they have money in investment accounts or IRAs and stuff like that. And so a realtor might see that and say, hey, they're financing 100%, so they're not as financially secure as a conventional mortgage. So we have to kind of educate the realtors along the way. You and I both do. We go back and forth and just tell them, like, hey, just because our client's putting zero money down doesn't mean that they're any less qualified. It just means they want to keep, one of our clients, they just want to keep their $200,000 or $300,000 in the bank. They don't want to put it towards their house. It's no crime in it.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, with an easier approval, I shouldn't say easier, but an easy approval. And the fact that if we're going to issue a pre-approval for a veteran, whether it's on a VA loan or a conventional loan, we're going to do our homework. And if we're going the VA route, we've done that homework and essentially said, hey, this is the best route for you. But exactly, to your point, it doesn't mean anyone's any less qualified. It's just that they've looked at all their options and they've determined this is what's best for me.
Yeah, and on a side note, a pro tip for realtors or people out there too is this. So let's just compare conventional and a VA for a second, right? We have a conventional buyer, let's say, it's been saving and saving and saving. Conventional mortgages can go down to 5%, right?
Who knows what interest rates do, but I'm following you.
No, but 5% down.
5% down. You can do 3% down for a first-time home buyer.
So let's just say that a homeowner, a buyer is putting down, they've saved and saved and saved for 6 months, and they got the 3 to 5% money down, and now they're writing an offer on a property going against the VA, the veteran.
Instantly. And at the end of the day, with an easier approval, I shouldn't say easier, but an easy approval. And the fact that if we're going to issue a pre-approval for a veteran, whether it's on a VA loan or a conventional loan, we're going to do it. If we're going the VA route, we've done that homework and essentially said, hey, this is the best route for you. Exactly, to your point, it doesn't mean anyone's any less qualified. It's just that they've looked at all their options and they've determined this is what's best for me.
Yeah, and on the side note, a pro tip for realtors or people out there too is this. Let's just compare conventional and a VA for a second, right? We have a conventional buyer, let's say, been saving and saving and saving. Conventional mortgages can go down to 5%, right?
Rates do, but I'm following you.
No, but 5%. So let's just say that a homeowner or a buyer is putting down, they've saved and saved and saved for 6 months. And they got the 3 to 5% money down, and now they're writing an offer on a property going against the VA. The veteran is putting 0 money down. So now, in that case, who might actually have the better scenario to follow through if something were to happen? You know what I'm saying? So the veteran could have, let's say, $50,000 in the bank, but now it's kind of almost like a stigma that they putting 0% down, they don't have any money. But your person that's struggling to make that 3 or 5% down payment, if anything happens with the appraisal, home repairs, they're tied up. They don't have any extra cash. A way to go.
Yeah, and in my opinion on that is you're onto something. Just because you're financing 100% of the purchase price doesn't mean that you're not more financially qualified. And 100% financing doesn't really have anything to do with how qualified you might be, in a different token. And that's where it's important with, real estate agents such as yourself that can speak the language to the listing agents, selling agents, and say, hey, this is what my client brings to the table.
So Mike, can you tell me what the VA pre-approval process is in Madison, Wisconsin?
So, VA loan pre-approval is just the same as pretty much any other pre-approval process. When you go to get a mortgage, you tend to get pre-approved before you start looking for properties. I'm sure you'd agree with me. The only major steps that are different are we have to prove that the veteran's eligible to use their VA benefit. It's as simple as filling out the certificate of eligibility application, sending it to VA, and we'll get an answer on that. But ultimately, with whichever lender you choose to work with, it's well-versed and well-qualified with VA, and they'll guide you through that process.
What are some of the documents if somebody's thinking about getting a mortgage? As you obviously know, because you do it every day, what are some of the documents that people need to have if they want to get pre-approved? So let's say they're thinking about it and they're like, I'm going to go do this like Tuesday next week. So what things can I kind of start gathering just to have a head start on getting pre-approved?
For active military members, their LES, or at least their last two, we'll want to look at W-2s for the last 2 years, statements for the last 2 months typically. And then if it is a veteran that we haven't already proven eligibility for, we're going to need proof of service in some way, shape, or form, which qualified lender can tell you exactly what you need based on what your service history looks like, and they should be asking you those questions. If your prior service, a DD-214 showing an honorable character of service is important to have for the eligibility part. active duty. Sometimes a statement of service letter is what's needed. Just depends on the circumstance. But again, the pre-approval process is very similar to any other. It's just more catered to
the veterans.
veterans.
Yes, and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's the same. You just have a couple extra things.
Yep.
Speaking of, kind of go backtrack a little bit, kind of just clicked in my head. Minimum property requirements. I heard that now the VA is allowing some exceptions towards those minimum property requirements. Is that something that you've heard of so far, or something that is coming our way soon?
So it's always been a thing that there are exceptions to the rule, but they're reviewed case by case, and typically VA has to review those things directly. So I wouldn't bank on purchasing a home where there are going to be problems. But if there's something that your real estate agent, and John, you're really good at this, points out that might not meet minimum requirements and you can't negotiate to get it fixed, talk to your VA lender. Let them help you navigate through that, determine whether that's something that the VA is likely to make an exception on or not. But ultimately, it's up to VA whether they do that. But again, I wouldn't bank on that, but at least know there are options available potentially, depending on what the circumstances are.
Yeah, I think one thing that we do personally is that when I'm actually doing the showing, I'm looking for the things that would maybe, I don't say disqualify, but the appraiser's going to catch and want fixed, things like that. So we make a note of those items and kind of keep them in our back pocket almost, so we have them. And then when we do the home inspection, we start to get those items corrected. And then when the appraiser comes a little bit afterwards, hopefully we have those items fixed, or they're in the process of.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so important. And to speak to some of the work that you're doing as a real estate agent, you're getting ahead of that and you're being proactive so that you don't have a transaction 2-3 weeks down the road when you're pushing up against a closing deadline. And this isn't me giving my piece about why people should work with you, but the reality is because you're proactive and you handle those things before they become a problem, it gives you an advantage when you're.
Yeah, one of the thank you, by the way, I appreciate that. One of the things that what I do is the conversations that we have with the listing agents is we submit an offer to purchase. A buyer goes and sees the property, they like it, they're pre-approved, and we go to see the property, we submit the offer, and then I call the realtor and I say, hey, Joe or whoever it is, I just submitted you an offer to purchase for the property here, and we go over all the highlights. And I tell them, hey, the lender's going to be reaching out to you because Mike reached out to all the listing agents to let them know about the buyer's capabilities, not their exact history, but just, hey, these are good buyers. And then at that point, the listing agent sometimes will push back and say, hey, well, I don't know what kind of issues the VA loan this. And so we take what we know, and that finally I've done over 200 VA transactions, and these are the things that I see at the property that could potentially be an issue. I say, hey, there's some paint maybe, there's this, that, window, but otherwise, I don't see anything else. Or I say, hey, there's nothing that I see, or maybe it's a hand railing or something simple. So I think just catching those things up front, and then we can easily, when we get the pushback on the VA loan, we have the answer right as well.
Yeah, and it really is, when you're using your VA benefit, it's that education piece, because not everyone is going to be well versed, but having the right people on your team that can help advocate for you when things come up, and making sure that we're proactive versus reactive and can not only explain but educate, it's going to put you in a better position.
Yeah, and then one thing, I don't even know if we've talked about this before, is lately I've had some home inspectors start trying to tell me what is a VA requirement and what is not. And it's kind of frustrating, to be honest.
I can see why. I would probably ask them, hey, are you a VA eligible appraiser?
Yeah.
That'd be my question.
I mean, because, like we had one in Janesville, Wisconsin, he's a VA loan, and appraisers going to the property, and he said, yo, this is going to be flagged, this is going to be flagged. And I'm like, what are you talking about, man? Like, I don't think so, So just remember, even the realtor doesn't know what's going to be flagged. Like, if the loan guy doesn't know what's going to be flagged, the appraiser knows what's going to be flagged, though.
Yeah, and with that being said, me doing loans, I'm not going up to them. I only know what's going on. And, there's a fine line, too, between being proactive and saying, hey, this could be a problem, and nitpicking every last detail. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to what that VA eligible appraiser sees. And then we'll review that appraisal to make sure that it does in fact meet the minimum requirements. And if it doesn't, we'll inform you.
Man, Mike, thank you for being on the show today. I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with VA loans and all those things. If you haven't got Mike's info yet, Mike Schrader can be reached at 608-444-8255. 443. Or you can email him, mike.j.schrader@rate.com. Thank you again, Mike, for being on the show. And for all of you listening, please subscribe and like or comment on our post if you found this valuable. I hope you guys have a great day, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Veteran Realtor Podcast. This is John Reuter, your host, and I'm signing off for the day.